Welcome to Deep Dive. Welcome. We're thrilled to have you here. Let's dive in and grow together.
Welcome to Deep Dive. Today we're diving into J. Deepak's book, India, Bharat, and Pakistan, A Constitutional Journey. Section 2, covering the years 1899 to 1909. Now you might be thinking, why focus on such a specific period? Well, Deepak argues that these seemingly quiet years were actually the crucible where the fate of modern India was forged. Decisions made then about identity, religion, and political power still echo today. Buckle up, because we're about to uncover how seemingly small events set the stage for massive, long-lasting consequences. Deepak starts by taking us back to the late 1800s, a time when a resurgence of Islamic consciousness was sweeping through India. This wasn't just some abstract concept either. Deepak highlights specific movements and figures, like Syed Ahmed Khan and Syed Jamal ad-Din al-Afghani, who were actively promoting Muslim identity and pushing for their community's rights within the British colonial system. Now here's where Deepak's argument gets really interesting. He suggests that everyday British policies, like the way they collected census data, actually played a role in solidifying religious distinctions. By categorizing people based on religion, they inadvertently created a framework for communal politics. It's like they were laying the groundwork for the idea that Hindus and Muslims were separate entities with competing interests, even if that wasn't their intention. And this brings us to a pivotal moment, the 1905 Partition of Bengal. On the surface, the British presented this as a purely administrative move, claiming it would make governing more efficient. But Deepak argues there was a much deeper, more strategic game at play. He uses primary sources, like letters from Lord Curzon, the viceroy who pushed for the partition, to reveal the true agenda. Curzon wrote to the Secretary of State for India, admitting that the partition was designed to weaken the growing nationalist movement in Bengal. He even stated that it would give Muslims in East Bengal a unity which they have not enjoyed since the days of the old Muslim viceroys and kings. Got a smoking gun. So was this divide and rule strategy a long-term plan? Or was it more of a knee-jerk reaction to the rising tide of nationalism? Well, Deepak argues that it was a bit of both. The British had a history of exploiting differences between communities, but the partition was a particularly bold and calculated move. And it would backfire spectacularly. As you might imagine, the partition didn't exactly go over well. It sparked outrage among Bengali Hindus, igniting the Swadeshi movement, which encouraged people to buy local goods, and the boycott movement, which rejected British products. It's fascinating to see how the British, in trying to quell nationalism, actually fueled it. But the story gets even more complicated. The partition also galvanized Muslim political aspirations, leading to the formation of the All India Muslim League in 1906. It's like this single event set in motion two powerful, yet divergent forces. Deepak doesn't stop at just describing what happened, though. He takes us deeper, exploring the contrasting ways Hindus and Muslims approach education during this period. Many Hindus, especially those eager to integrate into the colonial system, embraced Western education, often at the expense of traditional knowledge. They saw Westernization as the key to progress. Muslims, however, adopted a different strategy. They blended Western education with Islamic learning. They weren't just seeking assimilation, they were playing the long game, aiming to eventually reclaim political power while preserving their cultural identity. Now imagine these simmering tensions in divided Bengal, and these two communities forging distinct paths with a powder keg waiting to explode. And that brings us to another pivotal moment, the Simla Deputation of 1906. A delegation of Muslim leaders, led by the Aga Khan, went to meet Lord Minto, the viceroy, in Simla. They were there to secure crucial assurance, separate Muslim representation in future councils. This was a huge win for the two-nation theory, the idea that Hindus and Muslims were distinct nations destined for separate paths. Now, you might not be familiar with the two-nation theory, but it's crucial to understanding the events that would unfold. But wait, were the British really on board with this idea of separate electorates? It seems like they were actively promoting a divided India. Well, it's complicated. Deepak dives into British parliamentary debates from this period, and they reveal a mixed bag. Some lawmakers saw separate electorates as a practical necessity. Given the religious and cultural diversity of India, they believed it was the only way to ensure fair representation. Others were more cynical, seeing it as a way to keep the communities divided and easier to manage. So it was a genuine attempt at fairness, or a calculated maneuver to maintain control. Deepak doesn't offer a simple answer. Instead, he presents the arguments from both sides, urging us to grapple with the complexities and ambiguities of this historical moment. And here's where things get even more tangled. Remember, the Indian National Congress, the leading force for independence, well, even they were deeply divided during this period. On one side, you had the moderates, who favored gradual reform within the British system. They believed in working with the colonial government to achieve self-rule over time. On the other side, you had the extremists, who demanded complete and immediate independence. They saw the British as an occupying force and believed that any form of cooperation was a betrayal. Imagine the debates. The 1907 Congress session in Surat literally erupted in chaos as these factions clashed. It was a dramatic illustration of just how fractured the nationalist movement was. So much for a united front, right? So we've got a partition Bengal, the rise of the Muslim League, separate electorates on the horizon, and a Congress at war with itself. It's like all the pieces are on the board, and the game is about to get very, very real. And Deepak doesn't shy away from the really uncomfortable aspects of this period. As these constitutional paths seemed to be leading nowhere, frustration was brewing, particularly among those who favored a more radical approach to independence. Think of it like this. Alongside the more mainstream constitutional methods of the Congress, you had these secret societies popping up across India, advocating for armed revolution. It was a risky, even dangerous path. But for some, it seemed like the only way to break free from the shackles of British rule. And Deepak introduces us to some truly fascinating figures from this revolutionary movement. People like Vinayak Damodar Savarkar, who wrote a book called The Indian War of Independence, 1857. Now, this wasn't just some dry historical account. It was a fiery call to action, glorifying the 1857 rebellion against the British and becoming a rallying cry for those seeking a swift and forceful overthrow of colonial rule. So as we head into 1909, we have this incredibly volatile mix, communal tension simmering, the Congress fractured, and these revolutionary movements gaining momentum. Deepak argues that these seemingly isolated events were actually threads woven together, forming the very fabric of modern India. And here's where Deepak's legal background really shines. He doesn't just tell us what happened, he dives deep into the primary sources, quoting letters, speeches, official documents, even British parliamentary debates, to reconstruct the context surrounding these decisions and the thinking behind them. Remember that letter from Lord Curzon we talked about earlier, where he admitted the true purpose of the Bengal partition? Well, Deepak takes it a step further. He reveals that Curzon didn't just stop at dividing the province. He actually went on a tour of East Bengal, specifically targeting Muslim audiences. And what did he tell them? He invoked their glorious past, reminding them of the days when Muslim rulers held sway over the region. He essentially promised that the partition would restore them to their former glory. It was a masterclass in political maneuvering, using history and identity to create a wedge between communities and secure their loyalty. But as we've seen time and time again, these kinds of political games can have devastating consequences. Deepak cites first-hand accounts of the violence that erupted after the partition. He quotes a British journalist describing a climate of fear gripping the Hindu community, with temples desecrated, shops looted, and communal riots breaking out. It paints a stark and disturbing picture of how quickly political divisions can translate into real-world suffering. And Deepak doesn't just focus on the partition. He takes us back to those British parliamentary debates surrounding the Minto Morley reforms. Remember, these reforms were supposed to be about giving Indians a greater voice in their own government. Sounds promising, right? But Deepak shows us how even these seemingly progressive measures were tainted by the same divide and rule mentality. He quotes British lawmakers openly acknowledging that separate electorates were designed to keep the communities separate, making them easier to manage. It's almost as if they were saying the quiet part out loud, admitting that their true goal was to maintain control, not foster unity. So what does this all mean? Well, Deepak argues that these reforms, while appearing to give Indians more power, actually laid the groundwork for partition. Instead of leading India towards unity and self-rule, They solidified the very divisions that would eventually tear the nation apart. And here's another layer of complexity that Deepak brings to light. It wasn't just the British who were pushing for separate identities and political destinies. He reveals that even within India, certain Muslim leaders were already advocating for a separate Muslim nation, distinct from Hindu India. Deepak dives into the writings of these early proponents of Muslim separatism, highlighting their arguments about feeling marginalized within a Hindu-majority society and seeing separate electorates as a way to safeguard their community's interests. It's important to remember that Deepak isn't presenting these arguments to endorse them, but rather to help us understand the historical context and the motivations of different players in this complex drama. Deepak takes us into the heart of the debate over separate electorates, highlighting a fascinating exchange in the British Parliament. One lawmaker, a man named Charles James O'Donnell, actually warned against this policy, predicting that it would lead to regret down the line. He argued that it was most regrettable that any religion should be brought down into the arena of political controversy. Now, O'Donnell wasn't some anti-colonial radical, he was a British MP. Yet he saw the potential for division and conflict that separate electorates would create. He even went so far as to say that by granting separate electorates, the British government was favoring the Muslim men and would inevitably spark resentment among the Hindu majority. And sadly, history would prove him right. But Deepak doesn't just present O'Donnell's warnings in isolation. He juxtaposes them with the arguments of other British lawmakers, who saw separate electorates as a necessary evil, given India's diverse religious and cultural landscape. They argue that India was not a homogeneous nationality, but rather a collection of different races and religions with competing interests, making separate electorates the only way to ensure fair representation for all. So on one hand, you have those who saw separate electorates as a cynical tool of control, designed to perpetuate division. And on the other hand, you have those who saw it as a pragmatic solution to the challenges of governing a vast and diverse population. It's this kind of nuanced exploration of different perspectives that makes Deepak's work so compelling. But remember, the story doesn't end there. Deepak reminds us that there were Muslim leaders within India who were actively advocating for separate electorates, not just as a matter of political expediency, but as a way to protect their community's rights and identity. He quotes Sayyid Ali Imam, the president of the Muslim League, who delivered a powerful speech in 1908, outlining the historical basis for Muslim separatism. Imam spoke about how Muslims had always been a distinct community in India, with their own laws, culture, and traditions, and how they deserved a system of representation that acknowledged and protected their unique identity. It's a reminder that the push for partition wasn't just some top-down imposition by the British, it was also fueled by genuine concerns and aspirations within India's Muslim community. And Deepak presents these arguments without judgment, encouraging us to grapple with the complexities of history and understand the motivations of different actors, even if we don't agree with them. So what does all this mean for us today, as we look back on this pivotal period in India's history? I think one of the most important takeaways is that the challenges India faces today, the issues of identity, religion, and political representation, aren't new. They have deep roots. Stretching back to these formative years of the early 20th century, Deepak's work is a powerful reminder that understanding history isn't just about memorizing dates and names. It's about grappling with the forces that have shaped our world, the choices people made, and the consequences that have rippled through time. And as we conclude this deep dive into J. Deepak's India, Bharat, and Pakistan, I think it's fitting to leave you with his powerful question. Did these events, these seemingly small decisions made between 1899 and 1909, set India on an irreversible path towards partition? It's a question that challenges us to confront the uncomfortable truths of the past and to consider how we can learn from history to build a more just and equitable future. A future where those lines in the sand don't lead to division and conflict, but rather to understanding and cooperation. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.